If you haven't heard about chunking for improved fluency and confidence in English, then you're in the right place. Chunking is a reading technique that helps you understand what you're reading better. And we know that at the heart of confidence and fluency is understanding. When you start using chunking to read, your speaking improves as well. And things just fall into place more easily. You're able to express yourself more clearly. We're going to look at chunking in the opening line of a classic English novel called The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman by Lawrence Sterne, which you've probably never heard of. But it is considered or ranked number 6 out of 100 best novels by The Guardian. The reason why you might not have heard about it before is because it's a very strange and complex novel. It's crazy. It just goes all over the place. And it's very funny in parts and very serious in other parts and just scandalous and it's a mixture of it's a crazy mental discourse on the life and opinions of this character who calls himself whose name is Tristram Shandy. And the classic novel Don Quixote is a very big influence on this novel. But of course, it's quite different also. But the important thing in this video isn't so much about the novel, although of course if you find it interesting, please do your own research, and if you'd like to read it, go ahead, or just read parts of it. But I've chosen it for this video because this first opening line, well, first of all, is quite famous, and second of all, lends itself perfectly well to the topic of this video, which is chunking. So if you're ready, let's get started. If we haven't met yet, my name is Tanya Meyer. I'm an English as a foreign language teacher to adults, specializing in mindfulness practices to bring joy, understanding, calm, relaxation to your English language acquisition and use. Okay, before we get into chunking, let me tell you a little story about when I was at school. Back in those days, there was a very popular song on the radio by a group called Madness, an English group called Madness, and the song was called My House. And in that song, there was a part of the lyrics that said, "The kids are playing up downstairs." Now, at that time, even though I've spoken English all my life, so, when you get confused with English as a learner, don't think that we, people who have spoken English all our life, don't get confused with the language. We do. Sometimes we think, wait, what was that? Playing up downstairs? Where is up downstairs? I don't get it. It was only many years later that I understood what the problem was, and that was that I had been chunking incorrectly. So what is chunking? Well, simply put, it's the breaking down of long pieces of information into smaller units of meaning for better overall understanding. In English specifically, which is so filled with phrasal verbs and collocations, which are groups of words that go together and that we can't really separate, the question of chunking is really important. And if you happen to chunk incorrectly, then the whole sentence loses its meaning. And you might think, I don't know what that means, even if you understand every word. So let's take a look at the opening line of our classic novel, Tristram Shandy, and see what we can make of it together. Okay, so let's take a look at these opening lines of the novel, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman by Lawrence Sterne. I hope that, like me, the first thing that you see is, wow, that's a long sentence. This whole opening paragraph here is a single sentence. And so, of course, we need chunking. Okay, so why don't we do this together? This is English from immediately before the French Revolution. So we're talking about 1750. So this is quite old English. But as there are a few words that I'll explain, but let's see how we get on. The important thing is to break it down into smaller units of meaning so that we can understand everything. So here's how the novel starts. I wish either my father or my mother, okay, so that's a unit of meaning, or indeed both of them. The unit of meaning here is being expressed with the comma, as they were in duty both equally bound to it, as they were in duty both equally bound to it, meaning that they were both responsible for it. And here another chunk. I wish that they, my mother and father, had minded what they were about. In other words, had been more aware of what they were doing when they begot me. In other words, when I was conceived. Had they duly considered how much depended upon what they were then doing, had they duly considered, in other words, had they taken into account how much depended upon what they were then doing, and here there's like a little parenthesis, that what they were then doing was that not only the production of a rational being was concerned in it, so not only that, but that possibly, another chunk, the happy formation, another chunk, and temperature of his body, another chunk, perhaps his genius, and the very cast of his mind, yes, all of that, and another chunk, for aught they knew, this means for all they knew, or as far as they were concerned, to the contrary, and for aught they knew to the contrary, even the fortunes of his whole house, another chunk, might take their turn, or might depend on, or be a result of, from the humors and dispositions which were then uppermost meaning the most important thing at that moment, the moment of my conception, okay, had they referring to my mother and father, had they duly weighed, in other words, if they had been responsible enough to consider, had they duly weighed and considered all of this that I just mentioned here, and proceeded accordingly, I am verily persuaded, verily means absolutely persuaded, I should have made quite a different figure in the world from that in which the reader is likely to see me. In other words, to shorten this paragraph or this sentence, what the writer is saying is that if his parents, at the moment of his conception, had understood what they were doing, in other words, that they were bringing into the world not only a rational being, but everything to do with that rational being, the formation, yes, the temperature of his body, his intelligence, the quality of his brain, and even, perhaps his fortune, and everything concerned with him, if they had realized that, then perhaps the reader would have a completely different impression of this character who is introducing himself right now from the impression that we are going to have with the rest of the novel. But as you can see, the important thing here isn't so much, the rest of the novel, but the way in which language needs to be broken down into smaller units of meaning so that we can understand the whole. Were you already familiar with chunking? Let us know in the comments if you've ever chunked incorrectly in English. Okay, do you remember the song I told you about before that used to confuse me as a teenager? The song My House by Madness. It said, "The kids are playing up downstairs." Well, many years later when I was living in England, I came across the phrasal verb playing up. And what playing up means is misbehaving. So it was a matter of chunking incorrectly that had prevented me from understanding those lyrics, because what they said was that the kids were playing up downstairs. That means that the kids were misbehaving downstairs. And then all of a sudden, everything makes sense. We tend to chunk certain pieces of information very in a very standard way in our own language. For example, telephone numbers or house numbers, address numbers, things like this. And if somebody chunks incorrectly to us, we might have to, even when we understand every number, we understand what they're saying, we can't record the information on time or correctly. We're confused because the information isn't being delivered to us in such a way that we can grasp it easily, because we're expecting a certain pattern or a certain way of chunking when this information is being delivered, like telephone numbers and addresses. Now, chunking is relevant when we speak as well, because we don't speak like this. Instead, what we do is that we chunk in a way that people can follow. Do you see what I mean? So if we're chunking correctly as we speak, then it doesn't matter how convoluted our sentences, it doesn't matter how much we digress and come back and move forward and go back in time, as long as we're chunking in a way that the listener can follow us, then we have their attention without them having to make a lot of effort. And it's easy for us to communicate a lot of information or information that takes a long time for us to transmit completely without the listener losing track or having to ask us to repeat or being lost because we've chunked incorrectly or we've made a pause where they don't expect it and suddenly they've lost track. So when we're able to chunk in such a way that it's natural and we're giving a natural cadence and rhythm to the language that we're using, then whoever's listening to us is very happy to follow. So when it comes to speaking English, it isn't just grammar and vocabulary that you need to know. Of course, grammar and vocabulary are the two pillars of language, but two pillars don't make a construction, And there is so much more to language than grammar and vocabulary, and it's so interesting. So if you want to find out more about what you can do to improve your language skills on your own, then do pick up a copy of my free guide, How to Revolutionize Your English, which you'll find a link for in the description box below. And I look forward to interacting with you in the next video. See you then. Bye for now.